Welcome to Equitania. We are here because of a tailings dam failure, which has seriously impacted the population. To understand what happened, we're going to talk about the region's history, learn about Equitania, explore Newman State, and finally, address the mine-affected region. We will start by learning about the complaint filed by people who were affected by the tailings dam failure, and then jump into the history of this region for context. Every detail matters, so follow along. We are residents of Uso Village in southern Equatania, where a highly toxic mudslide caused by Uso Mining Limited YML recently obliterated our agricultural lands, our only source for income and food. Despite the company's acknowledgement that this tragedy should not have occurred and its half-hearted promises to remedy the situation, it has utterly failed to live up to its responsibility of relocating the affected population and providing appropriate and immediate compensation to all who are directly and indirectly impacted. Furthermore, even before the tragic mudslide occurred, Uso Mining Limited has been harming our people and our environment, with no regard for the safety or feelings of the population, and against its own requirements to comply with the performance standards of the Regional Development Bank, which shamelessly provided financing for this project. Specifically, the company has trampled the rights of several workers who are active members of the union representing local Uso mining employees. We have been informed that on one occasion, a company manager threatened to sack a worker if he continued to stir things up among employees and the wider community. Several months ago, a resident of Uso was killed when he drowned in one of the YML's small sludge ponds near the mine's southernmost periphery. Clearly, the area around this pond should be better sealed. The sad episode demonstrates the company's negligence and its lack of regard for the safety of Uso residents. Toxic runoff from YML's mining operations is seriously impairing the River Newman, and more recently, the once pristine Lake Newman. This is evidenced by the steadily declining fish population in both bodies of water, which we and other communities rely on for our very livelihoods. To address and resolve our concerns, we, the signatories of this complaint, demand the following actions be taken. YML must secure alternative, uncontaminated agricultural lands for each of the 40 families who have been impacted by the mudslide so that we can immediately return to production. In addition, the company must relocate all of the affected families to new homes to ensure that we continue to live in close proximity to our agricultural lands, as traveling long distance to reach the new fields will be untenable. Immediately provide compensation to the families whose lands have vanished, and to any others who have relied on the income and food that those lands have been providing. The amounts of compensation paid to each family should be decided by those families themselves and not by YML. The company, together with relevant authorities from the government of Equatania, must take steps to clean up the toxic sludge that has buried our fields and now poses a threat to our water and air quality and our long-term health and survival. YML should immediately halt its practice of dumping of toxic waste into the River Newman and begin compensating fishing communities whose way of life is slowly vanishing. YML should disclose its plans for expansion of the mine and make public A. plans for preserving the flora and fauna that are native to this region, and B. their strategy for securing the free, prior, and informed consent of the Newman people, who hold customary rights to the land slated for mine expansion. The Regional Development Bank, RDB, should conduct an audit to ensure that Uso Mining Limited is adhering to the required standards regarding health, safety, environment, relocation, and labor practices. Yours sincerely, representatives of Uso Women Produce to Market Cooperative, representatives of Coalition for the Future of Equitania, CFFE, representatives of Friends of the Planet, Sweden. This background briefing was prepared from public and RDB sources. The Office of Complaint and Resolution of Complaints from the Public, OCRCP, of the Regional Development Bank, RDB, has determined that 1. The Regional Development Bank holds a 5% equity stake in USO Mining Limited, YML. 2. The Women's Produce to Market Cooperative, WPMC, and the Coalition for the Future of Equitania, CFE, are duly registered civil society organizations under the law of Equitania. And 3. The complaint prima facie alleges facts that, if true, would constitute non-compliance with the RDB performance standards. The complaint has therefore been accepted for further investigation by OCRCP. Equitania is a country whose territory was part of the Numian Empire in the pre-colonial period. Numia was large and prosperous. It is noted in history books as an example of a functioning democracy, which predated its European counterparts. Under the traditional system, the local council of elders, comprised of men of a certain age from each village, selected a senior elder, who acted as a kind of mayor and was also counselor to a regional chief. Regional chiefs were in turn senators to a Numian king, chosen from among them. Allegiance to the king was expected of all Numians, but in practice, there is much regional and local autonomy. At village, regional, and kingdom levels, decisions were mostly made by consensus. Numia was always largely inhabited by the Numa people, but as a cosmopolitan regional economic power and trading center, it also attracted many different ethnic minorities. The largest of the groups were the Boma, whose homeland was encompassed by the Numian kingdom. The relationship between the Boma and Numians has been historically ambiguous. Numians generally believed that Boma people were subjects of the Numian king and allowed a large degree of regional autonomy. Boma, however, believed that they are independent of the kingdom, but freely associated with the Numian Empire. The Boma leader was called a chief by the Numians, but a king in the closely related Boma language. This difference in nomenclature had few practical implications and was never tested. Numia was an early colony of Great Britain. The Numian territories were put under direct colonial administration, and for administrative purposes, the colonial rulers created northern and southern Numia, separated by the Numa River. The king and Numian chiefs resisted British colonization. The king became well known at home and abroad for his refusal to assume the figurehead role expected of him by the colonial administration. He fled to the forest to organize resistance and a series of attacks against the British, often with some success. Despite his status as a hero among many native Numians, the British viewed his attacks as acts of terrorism and often brutally suppressed them. The king and his extended royal family were eventually tracked down and murdered to prevent their reemergence as political leaders. The Boma, however, took advantage of English colonization to cement their independence from the Numian kingdom. The Boma king petitioned the British crown for protectorate status, in part to secure a port at the mouth of the Numa River, and also to secure territory that was safe from Numa attacks. The territory that is now Equitania was carved out of northern Numia for the Boma. Because of a bend in the river, and possibly the map maker's whim, a Numian chieftaincy was included along with the 4 minor chieftaincies that made up the Boma kingdom to create Equitania. Equitania's southern border is the Numa River, across which is southern Numia. To the west is the Numian Sea. To the north and east is northern Numia. Equitania City became a cosmopolitan city, known in the west as the Jewel of Numia. With its relative lack of conflict and beautiful beaches close by, it became a favored spot for colonial administrators to spend holidays and even to retire. As a port city, it developed a sophisticated commercial code and judicial tribunals to administer them. It attracted trading and mining companies, which brought supporting infrastructure and later, the first university in the region. The British, unaware of the mineral wealth beneath its soil, were less interested in the lands of Equitania beyond the port of Equitania City. In any case, the colonial budget was stretched by the cost of maintaining a military presence across much of northern and southern Numia to put down occasional anti-colonial uprisings. Thus, the British primarily left Equitania and its Boma administration alone. The Boma in turn largely ignored the Newman chieftaincy within Equatania, which had never been part of their traditional territory. This meant that from 50 kilometers outside the capital, there were few signs of the colonial presence in Equatania. On paper, colonial Equatania was comprised of 5 states, 4 ethnically Boma and 1 ethnically Numa, and their colonial state governors. Each state was made up of counties, and each county had a commissioner. The larger towns also had appointed mayors, but these were positions primarily for colonial administrators who resisted taking early retirement. Their key assignment was criminal justice, but in practice, this was the domain of traditional leaders. There were, however, many mission churches, which succeeded in converting many Boma, and to a lesser extent Numa, to Christianity. The independence movement gained momentum in Equatania, as it did across the rest of the continent. Leaders emerged in both southern and northern Numia, who claimed to be heirs of the Numian throne, and who advocated a return to the pre-colonial boundaries of Greater Numia. In northern and southern Numia, there was significant violence. It was most severe in southern Numia, where colonial settlement was most pronounced. As the end of the colonial rule became inevitable, Britain moved to grant independence to Equatania. It was thought that this would keep Equatania and its port firmly within the Commonwealth. It was also intended as leverage for negotiations with northern and southern Numia. They too would be granted independence if their leadership met certain demands, such as renouncing any claims to a Greater Numia and providing constitutional protections for European settlers. Equatania's independence was the trigger for European settlers in southern Numia to declare their independence from Great Britain under a constitution that allowed only whites to vote in the new Southern Numia Republic. This provoked civil war in southern Numia. Northern Numia, whose elite were increasingly interested in the emerging mining and agricultural sectors, and who feared the growing Marxist rhetoric in southern Numia, quickly negotiated its independence from Great Britain and joined the Commonwealth. It was feared that ethnic Numians of Numa State in Equatania might support southern Numian freedom fighters, known as the Numian Liberation Front, NLF. But having never felt supported from them during the colonial period, Equatania's Numa largely stayed out of the conflict. Numian freedom fighters who crossed the river into Equatania could take refuge in Numa State, but there was no direct assistance. Ethnic Numians, as well as most Equatanians, supported their government's position that southern Numia should be a democracy with majority rule. But in reality, there was little appetite among either the Boma or Numa in Equatania to risk being drawn into the conflict and bloodshed to the south. At the end of a 10-year deadly civil war, the white government of southern Numia was deposed and replaced by a one-party communist state. It claimed sovereignty over all of Greater Numia, including Equatania and northern Numia. This was seen by many to be the exuberant rhetoric of a new state. Diplomatic protests were registered any time the southern Numian president spoke of Greater Numia. But little real note was taken, particularly after the southern Numia took the offending provisions out of its constitution in order to be admitted to the continent's Organization of Independent States. Southern Numia and Equatania were even able to cooperate in the construction of the Lake Numa Dam, which doubled the surface area of Lake Numa and now provides hydropower to both Equatania City and the capital of southern Numia, Great Numia. An impressive series of locks and channels that allow commerce to continue up and down the river were named the Friendship Waterway. For many years, Equatania enjoyed benefits as the jewel of Numia. The port grew as Equatania became a regional trading hub. Southern Numia in particular was dependent on Equatania City as its major port. Large ships offloaded onto barges that crossed the Numa River, as its own port plans never materialized. Equatania commercial courts operating under UK law were respected. The city hosted increasing numbers of international companies working in the region. The Boma People's Coalition, BPC, a business-friendly social democratic coalition that controlled more than 70% of seats in the national parliament, was credited with its technocratic approach to government. Equatania's GDP growth led the continent, and it was lauded by the international development community. The Equatania interior remained less developed, but the national government was slowly building on colonial administrative structures at state, county, and town levels to deliver healthcare, education, and agricultural extension services to the population. This caused friction with the traditional elders and chiefs, who felt they should administer any such benefits within their territories, consistent with their historical roles. There was also a sense within Numa State that more benefits flowed to majority Boma states. However, many observers believed these tensions were manageable, and there was a sense the country was moving forward. However, Equitania soon became embroiled in regional dynamics. Northern Numia saw an ever-growing chasm between the elite classes and those who felt excluded from their control of their natural resources, including quality agricultural land and the mining sector. A populist Democratic People's Party, DPP, emerged to challenge the governing Numian National Congress, NNC. DPP's primary message was that only the skin color of the oppressor had changed at independence. Corruption, capitalism, and indifference to the suffering of ordinary people were said to be destroying Numia. Election violence became widespread in rural areas as it became clear that the Democratic People's Party was gaining support and the Numian National Congress sought to keep control. Southern Numia was also struggling following the Civil War. There was some validity to claims by the Numian Liberation Front, still ruling the country with an iron hand, that anti-communist policies of Western countries were hurting its development. The country survived largely by bartering agricultural goods for in-kind assistance from China. But there was perhaps more truth in the observation that the Numian Liberation Front's militarization and adventurism in every civil war on the continent had bankrupted the country. The Western press reported that NLF leaders had fortunes stashed away in offshore bank accounts, which led to internal unrest and even more oppressive practices by the government. When rumors circulated in northern Numia that the Numian Liberation Front was supporting the Democratic People's Party, the Numian National Congress voted immediately to ban the DPP as illegal foreign operatives in northern Numia. Protests erupted across northern Numia. For the first time, the army, loyal to the Numian National Congress, was deployed against its own people. The Numian Liberation Front in southern Numia declared that it, with its president who claimed to be descended from the Numian hero king, was the only legitimate representative and protector of the Numian people. Some observers noted that industries and mineral resources of northern Numia might have also attracted the Numian Liberation Front's attention. It reasserted its claim to a greater Numia under Numian Liberation Front's control, and war broke out between southern and northern Numia. Although Equatania's government declared itself neutral, the Boma People's Coalition began lending indirect support to the Numian National Congress of northern Numia. The Boma People's Coalition refused or delayed Chinese shipments to southern Numia in an attempt to limit an arms trade, while providing the conduit for Western trade credit and financial assistance to the Numian National Congress in the north. The Numian Liberation Front launched an attack on Equatania City to gain control of the port. The Numian Liberation Front was careful to declare that it had no conflict with the Boma people, whom it said deserved the same autonomy within Greater Numia that it had enjoyed in the pre-colonial period. The aim of its attack, it said, was the capitalist class aligned with the Numian National Congress. The Equatania government declared itself allied with northern Numia against southern Numia. The northern Numian army joined in the defense of Equatania City with the now overt support of Western governments, including Great Britain. The events that unfolded in Equatania shocked most foreign observers, and even some locals, when the president of Equatania called for all the country's sons and daughters to come to the nation's defense. Voices in the rural areas rose against the president. It emerged that the Democratic People's Party had long been organizing local communities across the northern Numian border in the Boma states of Equatania. They had formed the Equatania Democratic People's Party, or EDPP. Their message of a corrupt, capitalist elite indifferent to the people had taken hold among many. Why, they asked, should they die in defense of commercial interests in northern Numia or Equatania City? In Numa State, the reaction had different motivations, but the same effect. There was limited appetite to put lives at risk to support Boma elite, particularly when Numa State was most vulnerable to Numian Liberation Front's attacks. As the Boma People Coalition-aligned Equitania army retaliated against what it thought was a fifth column within the country, civil war broke out in Equitania. Grievances over the highly centralized power of national government, its perceived undermining of traditional institutions through the use of colonial structures, underdevelopment of the interior, and the nature of the economy and distribution of benefits came to the fore. Communities were divided, with some Boma elders on one side and some on the other. The war became brutal, with even brothers often fighting against one another. Even once the Numian Liberation Front had been contained, and the war between northern and southern Numia ended, the civil war in Equatania continued. Guerrilla forces aligned with the Equatania Democratic People's Party fought against the Boma People's Coalition-aligned army, even in Numa State. Companies and international organizations left Equatania City, further exacerbating the economic and political crisis. Investment in the interior halted altogether. The national government managed to limp along on the basis of trade ties with the South, which still depended on the port. The rebels survived largely from the timber trade. International concern grew over Equatania's emergence as a drug transshipment point for the region, with leaders from both sides implicated in the illegal trade. Yet international intervention seemed impossible. Since the conflict was not geographically defined within the country, no buffer zone could be created. Equatania's civil war dragged on for 10 years, with seemingly no end in sight. Then, 10 years ago, the efforts of two women created an opening for peace. Both war widows, married to brothers who died on opposite sides of the Civil War, they undertook what was called the Long March to Peace. They walked from village to village across Equatania, asking that two women in each place join their march. Soon, they numbered in the thousands. Their demand was that the fighting stop, and that everyone come to a common table to talk about peace. A widely respected Boma elder, once a senator and senior advisor to the Boma king, declared it had come to him in a vision that these women carried the spirits of mothers of the nation, powerful figures from Boma mythology. He said they must be heeded. People who were weary of war seized on the moment. A ceasefire was soon declared, a conference of national unity was convened, and a new constitution was drafted. International donors worried that renewed civil war in Equatania could reignite conflict in the broader region, began providing immediate support. The new constitution, built on a number of key principles, a welfare clause, stated the natural wealth of the country existed to support the well-being of all people. A commerce clause acknowledged the role of private enterprise within the economy, while permitting competing state-owned enterprises. A decentralization clause stated any decision impacting human security should be made at the lowest appropriate level of government. A traditional institution clause declared equal legitimacy of the neo-colonial and pre-colonial governance structures, subject to local democratic support. An equal protection clause guaranteed equal rights for women and ethnic minorities. A reconciliation clause protected from criminal prosecution all persons willing to give a full account of their role in the war and apology for wrongdoing. At the national level, government took the form of a parliamentary democracy based on the Westminster model. Similar structures were replicated at the state and county levels, and at the town level for those with more than 5,000 inhabitants. An independent judiciary was established. Additionally, senior elders could serve as magistrates and chiefs as judges were democratically endorsed by the people within their traditional territories. Concerns were raised from various corners that many of the provisions of the new constitution were contradictory, that the Westminster winner-take-all legislative model failed to account for the consensus-based ethos of both Boma and Numa culture, that government structures were ambiguously overlapping, and that the reconciliation clause left war criminals in positions of high authority. But these were downplayed at the negotiating table, comprised of the Boma People's Coalition, the Equatania Democratic People's Party, and foreign diplomats pressing for a swift solution. The new constitution was put to referendum. The women of the Long March to Peace were bitter that they had been excluded from the negotiating table, that their own efforts had enabled, but they declared that the constitution, however imperfect, should be supported in the name of peace. Over 75% of votes were cast in favor of the new constitution. National elections were quickly organized with foreign support. Former U.S. President Jimmy Carter led an international election observers mission, which found Equatania's first election under the new constitution to be free and fair. There was concern when national parliamentary elections were announced. The less developed states of Numa, Vigari, and Morona voted EDPP, while the more developed Otanga and Equatania states voted BPC. This resulted in a 51% to 49% split between BPC and EDPP, with the BPC benefiting from better election infrastructure and larger population. But when the EDPP leader accepted the election results as declared by the Equatania Independent Electoral Commission and shook the hand of the new BPC president, Equatania seemed to be on a path to peace. With neither northern nor southern Numia particularly stable, foreign actors were especially relieved to see peace come to Equatania. They liberally funded peace building, reconstruction, and development projects. Local NGOs emerged to propose and manage peace initiatives ranging from income generation to reconciliation to good governance to infrastructure development. Foreign NGOs and UN agencies competed for oversight of the larger projects. It was joked that after the long civil war, the greatest danger one now faced in Equatania was being run over by the white Land Cruiser of an agency competing for development dollars. Much was also afoot in the business community. Investor groups were established to rebuild the port and create a modern telecommunication infrastructure for the capital. The Regional Development Bank Group, a multilateral finance institution, established to contribute to economic development and social progress of countries on the continent, had been headquartered in Equatania City before the war. It announced it would return its operations there as soon as practicable. Companies wishing to have a presence in the region began seeking out headquarters locations and renting houses appropriate for expatriate managers. For the first time in Equatania's history, the economic development of the interior was a priority. Under a policy of investment for peace, the national government established palm oil production, especially suited to the 3 ethnic Boma states beyond the capital, as a national priority. In ethnic Numa majority Numa state, mining companies had long suspected that the mineral deposits already under development in northern Numia must also extend into Equatania. The National Ministry of Mining and Energy issued 2 prospecting licenses. They created the Tayacombe concession and Yuso concession, each named for the largest settlement within it. The Equatania government, the investor community, and their INGO partners declared that these agricultural and mining investments would be managed to the highest environmental, social, and ethical standards, consistent with international best practice and the new constitution. Unfortunately, neither the will nor the capacity for good governance in Equatania City has emerged. Despite all the aid dollars, Equatania's score for the Inequality Adjusted Human Development Index, IHDI, of the UN Development Program, UNDP, has shown only the most modest improvements, and its score on UNDP's Gender Inequality Index, GII, has not improved at all. Its ranking on Transparency International's Global Corruption Barometer went from bad to worse in the decade following the end of the Civil War. A prime example of presumed looting was the timber that disappeared from Equatania National Forest across the border to northern Numia. It has been assumed that this could not occur without army support. Equatania also experienced outbreaks of violence. These have taken 2 forms. The first was driven by competing gangs of unemployed ex-combatants in Equatania City, and increasingly the country's other major cities and towns. The gangs were engaged in protection rackets, allegedly extracting money from street corner fruit vendors to UN agencies, and competing for territory. The second was driven by the illegal drug trade that continued to flourish, as Numian Liberation Front leaders turned drug lords in southern Numia used Equatania as a transshipment point. It was rumored that the head of the Equatania Democratic People's Party had only accepted election defeat after his drug trafficking activities had been informally ratified by the army, still loyal to the Boma People's Coalition. 2 local reporters, one investigating the timber trade and the other investigating the drug trade, both died in strikingly similar motorcycle accidents on remote roads. Their deaths were quickly ruled accidents by the authorities. Despite the stable macroeconomic policies of the Boma People's Coalition government and the steady GDP growth they could report, there was only anecdotal evidence that the family incomes of ordinary Equatanians were rising, even as the newly emerging middle class flocked to newly built shopping malls. Many voices, particularly among traditional leaders and former rebel commanders, questioned whether the country was better off at all. The official spokesperson of the Donor Coordination Committee, DCC, comprised of major foreign governments providing aid to Equitania, the UN agencies and international development organizations active in the country, several Equitanian NGOs, and the Equitania government noted that serious issues needed to be addressed and that peace and development would take time. Numa State encompasses the territory of the Numian chieftaincy attached to Equitania by colonial mapmakers. While the exact history is unclear, it appears that many generations ago, Numian fishermen crossed the river from the south and established fishing settlements along the banks of Lake Numa. Some eventually migrated inward to form farming communities. At some point, they bumped into the Boma chieftaincies to the north in what is now Montgomery State. The boundaries were never completely clear, with the Boma chiefs claiming a border further south and the Numa chief claiming a border further north. But the lands in question were marginal. The implicit agreement was that as long as significant numbers of people didn't settle there, the question of exactly where the border lay did not need to be resolved. Also present in Numa State, as well as the neighboring Montgomery State, is a population of forest people called the Kaytek. The Kayteks live in the dense and biologically diverse, though slowly diminishing, Boab forest that straddles the Numa River in Equatania, northern Numia, and southern Numia. UNESCO has declared the Boab forest a World Heritage Site. From a commercial perspective, the Boab tree is less interesting than the wood from other indigenous forests of Numia. It has therefore not been commercially harvested. Because the Boab trees grow in an extremely acidic soil to which they have adapted, they are typically also not cleared for agriculture. Where lime is available to balance the soil pH, however, clear cutting has occurred, and where alternate sources of firewood are not available, people turn to the inferior Boab. The Kaytek are marginalized politically. They never sent a senator to the court of the Numian king, though the record is unclear about whether this is because they were excluded or because they declined to. They have never been represented in the Equitania government at any level. Only Northern Numia legally recognized the Kaytek as an indigenous people, and did so only under pressure from its Scandinavian aid donors. Equitania and Southern Numia do not recognize any special status for the Kaytek. They argue that all people of Numia are indigenous and have the same rights. The Kaytek's only real allies are former rebel commanders from the military wing of the Equatania Democratic People's Party. Mutual respect arose when the Kaytek provided food to the rebels, taking refuge in the Boab forest, and the commanders in turn protected the Kaytek from harassment and deforestation. Besides the Kaytek, Numa State is also home to a minority population of ethnic Boma, who live primarily in fishing villages. These were established when Boma fishermen moved upriver to form settlements along Lake Numa. But Boma are also found in Numa State's towns and villages. Since the Boma and Numa languages are closely related, and the social and political structures of traditional Boma and Numa society quite similar, it is not hard for the Boma to integrate. Intermarriage is common. Boma men could traditionally participate in local councils, and there is at least one example of a village choosing an ethnic Boma elder to be its counselor at the court of the Numa chief. Tensions exist between the ethnic Numa leaders of Numa State and the largely ethnic Boma national authorities in Equatania City. These are exacerbated by the Equatania Democratic People's Party control of most towns and the Numa State government. There also are tensions over the meaning and application of the new Constitution's decentralization clause. Only a few people seem to successfully cross political and ethnic divides. One appears to be the popular EDPP, an ethnic Numa member of parliament for Tycombe and the surrounding areas, Dr. Juana Luisa. Formerly a pop music star, she also has a PhD in economics. She was recently appointed by the president to a commission on sustainable economic development. Given the history of colonial and post-colonial neglect of the Numa ethnic majority state, traditional authorities are particularly influential at all levels of government. For example, people prefer traditional tribunals over courts administered at the county and state level under the oversight of the Federal Department of Justice. It is common for tension to ensue anytime the national or state government attempts to assert itself through the county and state structures created under colonialism, which are not coterminous with the chieftaincies, but rather emerge from vertical and horizontal lines drawn on a map. This leaves few institutions that are broadly trusted. One exception may be the health sector. Local health committees were pioneered during the war with the support of UNICEF, which successfully argued that child and maternal health were apolitical. They convened stakeholders to address issues of mutual concern, including immunization, nutrition, and more recently, a dengue fever eradication campaign. While they have disappeared in many parts of the country, they seem particularly robust in parts of Numa State. The Commission for Workplace Mediation and Arbitration, a Numa State initiative supported by the International Chamber of Commerce, also has been successful in settling many claims brought against companies by workers. Also, there are church leaders who protected people during the war, regardless of their ethnicity or political affiliation, who are respected today. When many of these leaders signed a letter to the president about Christianity and the need to attend to the poor, however, the president responded angrily, demanding they stay out of politics and attend to baptisms. The Numa have always been traders. This is partly because of geography. While considered treacherous by outsiders, the waters of Lake Numa and the Numa River never represented a barrier to the Numa themselves. The ethnic and family ties between Numa State and Equatania and southern Numa also permitted close cross-border ties, particularly among fishing communities who move freely by boat. This at various times has opened the Numa within Equitania to accusations of smuggling. The Numa have chaffed at the idea that people in faraway Equatania City could limit their interchange across artificial borders. As for the drug trade, Numa elders were opposed to its corrosive effects on respect for traditional authority by young men emboldened by money and weapons. But it is also viewed as another inevitable consequence of modern life. Rumor has it that some elders complain in public, but are secretly benefiting from the cross-border drug trade. Numa State is less implicated in the illegal timber trade, which tends to move across the border to northern Numia. The trading history of Numa is also tied to its natural resources. The fertile soils of Numa State, combined with the possibility of river transport, made it historically the vegetable basket for the urban centers of both Equatania City and Great Numia, across the river in southern Numia. Decades of war greatly disrupted production, transportation routes, and markets, but there is a growing view that agribusiness holds a future for Numa State. Similarly, the historically rich waters of Lake Numa and the Numa River supported a significant fishing industry on both sides of the border. With the river and armed border and communities politically divided, fish markets were also greatly disturbed by the war. While data are lacking, fish stocks do not appear to have rebounded to pre-war levels. Plausible explanations put forward by different observers include poisoning from war munitions, pollution, overfishing, habitat change resulting from the dam, and climate change. If the fisheries could be brought back, however, there would be many benefits for Numa State and its development. The most significant development in the post-war political economy of Numa State has been mining. Some were dismayed in Numa State when prospecting licenses were awarded by the National Ministry of Mining and Energy without local input. There also was outrage when it became clear that the concessions had been drawn to include land in neighboring Bagauri State. This was presumed to guarantee benefits to the Boma majority in that state. Even if the real mineral wealth was on Numa land, and as argued by some Numa elders, the state borders failed in any case to recognize the traditional Numa claims to all of the land underlying the concessions. Environmentalists in the Equatania capital, as well as abroad, decried the demarcation of mining concessions that could threaten the Boab forests and mark the extinction of any number of species, including the Boab tree frog, found only in that habitat. Locally, the Tayacombe welcomed the concession and potential opportunity. Commercially viable copper ore deposits had been confirmed. Numia Mining Limited, NML, the subsidiary of a diverse global mining giant, which had a track record of successful copper mining across the border in northern Numia, bought the mining rights. Company representatives promised jobs and economic growth for Equitania. There was much talk of the provision in the national mining legislation that allocated 3% of royalties for local development and an additional 15% to the state. Heavy equipment began to move up the Numa River. Migration followed. Tayacombe Village, once a farming hamlet, became a bustling town. From one day to the next, however, the story changed due to over-enthusiastic ore estimates and underestimated production challenges. NML's copper mine in northern Numia was deemed incapable of meeting its technical and financial targets and was slated for closure. Furthermore, Numia Mining Limited has seen its Tayacombe operations as adjunct to the much larger northern Numian mine. Without the one, the company said, the other made little sense. Numia Mining Limited abandoned its concession in Numa State and ceased all operations. Company buildings and some vehicles were donated to the Tayacombe municipality. The only remaining activities were those of an NGO created by Numia Mining Limited to replant trees in the forest lands it had cleared in anticipation of earth-moving operations. They did not employ enough people to keep Tayacombe from falling into poverty and political unrest. This has created an audience for the voices of both environmental NGOs and former rebel commanders who oppose large-scale mining. It is also rumored that Tayacombe is now a key drug smuggling point, using an airfield built by NML. The copper deposits of the USO concession were originally thought the inferior of the two. They were being developed by Menexia, a regionally based junior mining company that specialized in raising private equity for mines. Menexia built out its operations facility northeast of USO town, which also include expatriate housing, medical clinics, and training facility. Menexia also built a port facility and water treatment plant on Lake Numa. The two operation areas were connected by a road restricted to Menexia's use for its heavy equipment, primarily carrying ore. As in Tayacombe, the population of what was once a sleepy farm center exploded as young men from all over the country came to USO in search of jobs. While the wartime population had dwindled to under 4,000 people, current estimates are as high as 40,000 for the greater USO area. The growing population is spread mostly along the Numa City and Tayacombe roads. There is an officially designated USO expansion area to the north and east of town, negotiated between USO town and the traditional authorities, which is currently used for both human settlement and farming. There are also informal settlements further east and west of USO town. These have given rise to tensions with traditional authorities and local farmers who claim their land is being encroached upon. In the course of starting the USO mining operations, Menexia confirmed dramatically richer copper deposits in the USO concession. These are now the most important of the Numian region, if not the continent. The government of Equitania sought advice from the Regional Development Bank, RDB. Acting on its counsel, Equitania established that Menexia was incapable of developing the important ore deposits and forced Menexia to sell its interest. Menexia agreed, seeing an option to exit with enormous profit. It invoked an arbitration clause to secure an independent valuation of its interest. Though the number was high, Equitania, on the advice of the Regional Development Bank, did not contest it, on the assumption major sources of international capital be reluctant due to perceived hostility toward the protection of investor rights. Seeking greater control over the USO operations in light of the Numia Mining Limited experience, Equitania asked RDB to negotiate the creation of USO Mining Limited, YML. It is constituted as follows. The national government of Equatania holds a 30% equity stake through its wholly owned Equatania National Mining Company, INAMCO. An international joint venture comprised of two major international mining companies, Maple Leaf Mining MLM of Canada and Down Under Mining DUM of Australia, holds a 65% equity stake. MLM is the operating partner for the joint venture and for YML. The Regional Development Bank holds a direct 5% equity stake. Additionally, it provides some project financing to YML as well as advisory services to INAMCO. USO Mining Limited is subject to a concession agreement with the Ministry of Mining and Energy, as well as to national and state legislation, giving the government further revenue paths and means of control. Both Maple Leaf Mining and Down Under Mining are members of the International Council on Mining and Metals, ICMM. Each is a supporting company of the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative and participates in the UN Global Compact. Maple Leaf Mining has specific corporate policies acknowledging and promising to uphold the voluntary principles on security and human rights, the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, and the OECD Guidelines for Multinational Enterprises. The Regional Development Bank applies the IFC performance standards on environmental and social sustainability to its equity holdings and project finance loans, to which USO Mining Limited is contractually bound. Equitania is a member of the International Labour Organization and is a signatory to its core conventions, although these have not been implemented in national legislation. Operations of USO Mining Limited started in earnest 2 years ago. After difficult negotiations among USO Mining Limited partners and between USO Mining Limited and the Equatania government, Phase 1 emphasis has been on building production under Menexia's original plan. Maple Leaf Mining argued that capital should be prioritized according to a new master plan that incorporated the newly discovered and much richer deposits. It was agreed in the end, however, that the venture needed to build political support, and therefore would need to show tax revenues to the government and benefits to local communities sooner rather than later. This meant that USO Mining Limited built from Menexia's existing plant and operations. Even extremely rich copper ore deposits, such as those in Equatania, may contain on average only 4 to 6% of the pure metal. Copper mining operations therefore include the processing of the mine ore to achieve copper concentrates that can be sold to smelters and refiners. The ore is crushed into fine particles and subjected to a variety of chemical processes. This results in tailings, the leftover, finely crushed ore containing no commercially interesting material. These tailings are pumped into tailings ponds, secured by tailings dams. Tailings would be considered contaminants if they were released into the natural environment. The tailings dam must therefore be built to last forever, outlasting the useful life of the mine and the revenues available to maintain it. Menexia's copper mine included the construction of a tailings pond and tailings dam near the southern border of the Phase 1 mining area. Friends of the Planet, FOP, a Netherlands-based international environmental advocacy group, has apparently tracked investments of the Regional Development Bank over some years. It has raised concerns related to the Numia region, ranging from pollution in Lake Numa to the degradation of the Boab forests, to the rights of the Kaitek people, to adverse effects of the Lake Numa Dam, both in letters to the Regional Development Bank's management and in its international advocacy material. RDB officials say they take these communications seriously as inputs to its own work with the government of Equatania and other international development actors in the Numia region. FOP concerns were never considered formal grievances to the Office of Compliance and Resolution of Complaints from the Public OCRCP. However, as the Regional Development Bank never provided project finance to either NML's Tayacom operations or to Menexia's USO mine, the Office of Compliance and Resolution of Complaints from the Public does not accept complaints related to the Regional Development Bank's work with sovereign governments. FOP's local affiliate in Equatania is apparently the Coalition for the Future of Equitania CFE. CFE, as part of its larger mission, provides development support to the Women's Produce to Market Cooperative, WPMC, in USO. The Regional Development Bank has no record of direct contact until now with either CFE or WPMC. When the tailings dam failed and the mudslide occurred as alleged in the complaint to the OCRCP, the complaint was filed in a matter of days, presumably with the FOP's assistant, given the breadth of issues included. The parties have been notified that the Office of Compliance and Resolution of Complaints from the Public has accepted the complaint for further investigation.